Hi everyone, and welcome to my updated Frozen Orb Sorcerer's Guide. I already released a video for this like a week ago or so when I had freshly respec to this. Previously I was playing Ice Shards, and then I really wanted to try out Frozen Orb because I was excited about the Omnipower Heart. Now, I finished leveling this character to 100, I've cleared a tier 100 Nightmare Dungeon with this, and I learned a few more things on the way. For example, that Omnipower is really terrible. So I had like this original guide video out because a lot of people really wanted to play it and wanted to see my build. And it turns out Frozen Orb is actually just fine. It's not like a crazy build or anything like that. It's not like the meta defining OP sorceress here, but it worked. I cleared the tier 100 without really any trouble. This was basically first try right after I hit level 100. And this was on hardcore, and I gotta say I didn't really have much trouble with anything. Now, one thing to know here is the single target damage on Frozen Orb is really low, and well, the way I solved this was I included Ice Shards to defeat bosses and occasionally elites like suppressor guys and these kind of things. And with that combo, playing it a bit like the Flurry Rapid Fire Rogue with the 2 core skills, it actually worked out just fine. So my enchantments here were Fire Bolt for burning synergies and the Frozen Orb, so there was no Ice Shard enchantments or something like that. I did use the Barber, but it is not that necessary. I did actually try running this build without the Barber Heart, and effectively playing this a bit like Eternal Sorc that I would expect roughly on a power level with the upcoming patch, because there's a few buffs for this build actually. And well, it seems still fine for tier 100. Not super comfortable, but if you go down, let's say 10 tiers from there, it's already getting a lot smoother. And I cleared this run in, I don't know, something like 15 minutes or so. And for those guys saying that, well, this build doesn't work without the Barber, it's only carried by the heart, here's the run without it. This is also a tier 100. And yeah, of course, it's weaker because we just took out the strongest heart, but it's not like I couldn't really kill anything. So it still was working. I cleared like another run of that. Of course, it was slower, but again, it turns out just fine. So I think that Frozen Orb Sorcerer is actually in a fairly decent spot, and upcoming we have some buffs for it that should give it something like around 20% extra DPS or so. So that's actually pretty neat. And of course the toughness buffs that Sorceress is getting in patch 1.1.1. So in particular, the changes that we're going to see is the Storm Swell aspect, which is actually part of the build. So this is extra damage against vulnerable targets. This is getting increased from 20 to 30%. Snow Whale aspect also in the build. We get longer unstoppable duration and extra armor now, so the build is tankier. And also they are buffing the Frozen Orbit aspect, which is the one for Frozen Orb. In particular, for the extra explosions, that also goes from 30% per explosion to 40% per explosion. So overall, the total damage goes up quite significantly here. And there are some other buffs here on these Paragon nodes. So especially damage reduction wise, on most of these rare nodes go from 4 to 5%. I guess also the corresponding magic nodes on the Paragon trees go from 2 to 2.5% then, because they're usually always half of the value of the rare. And of course you can buff these with some of those glyphs that buff these rare nodes or buff these magic nodes, so you get even more out of that. And they're also increasing the damage reduction from glyphs. And I gotta say, yeah, the Frozen Orb build was not like the tankiest. I'm more used to Barbs and Rogue right now with like the builds I've played in Endgame. Of course it's squishier, but it wasn't just like, you know, I was getting annihilated off screen or something like that. So for those of you that have seen the old guide, there were a few changes. I'm gonna go through the items, the skills, and the paragons, so that you are fully up to date with what I was actually doing here. Now, number one is, you cannot actually play this build without getting some drop-only aspects. So what I did here is I made a level 50 kind of like setup you want to work towards with the codex powers, and they are actually based on Ice Shards only. So I figured Frozen Orbs just won't really do all that much damage without the aspect. There is one in particular, the Frozen Orbit aspect, that allows Frozen Orb to stay in place and explodes again. This is one of those that gets buffed in a patch. And then you have extra chances to apply Vulnerable, which is one of those perks here that you get with the Greater Frozen Orb, or you get more mana when you hit frozen enemies. So both of these are kind of viable options in the early game, but it just doesn't really work too well when you don't have this aspect at all. So until you find this, I would suggest just play with Ice Shards. So I made the setup like this. So it's relying on freezing and chilling enemies. You have the Ice Shard enchant, You have decent single target damage by just using ice shards, and you have the fireball enchant that helps you out with AoE damage. So it should be generally fine, just kind of like blasting away through the early game with this. You get the ice shard aspect in the codex, and a few like mana aspects like the prodigy, umbral, a few damage aspects here that just help you out a little bit, a few defensive ones, and that should be good to go. So this is nothing really crazy here, but once you actually have the setup, we have it here. So the Frozen Orbit is the one drop only aspect you really want. There's a second one, which is the Frozen Memories. This also gives you one additional cast for your Avalanche. So sometimes you trigger this Avalanche passive, which is the key passive down here, and that gives you an extra free cast that deals more damage. And well, when you shoot into a big pack, you have a pretty high chance of proccing these lucky hits because they actually stack various lucky hit bonuses. For example, there's precision magic on a tree. There's also some stuff on the paragons. You try to get it on your wand base, you try to get it maybe on the glove or on the helm. So there are various sources of lucky hit to the point where you have like roughly double the chance of triggering all the stuff that you want to trigger. And the avalanche actually keeps popping up quite a lot. Another really important aspect that you can get in the codex, but you also want to get a better power on, is the prodigies aspect. This gives you 25 mana when you use a cooldown. I think a lot of sorcerer builds just use this naturally because of all those defensive skills that you usually put into most sorcerer builds. So you kind of have a lot of cooldowns naturally. This build has 4 of them. You have 2 core skills, and you can just press them, you know, back and forth and try to restore your mana that way. One thing that really helps that I actually never really got to work with is resource generation on the ring. So if you have at least one ring with resource generation, you're going to get significantly more mana regen passively, and it also buffs this active mana regeneration. So if you get a ring like this, or you know, something like resource, crit life, or something like that, this is superb. I was playing the setup without a resource generation ring and it was still working, but I think it will be a bit smoother at least when you have that. The rest of the aspects are either offensive or defensive in nature. There's nothing really special here. We have a disobedience for extra armor, snow veiled, this is getting a buff. It also gives you armor after the patch. Ever living, more damage reduction. I have Asus heirloom here. I actually found these boots at some point. I used them for a while. I threw them out, and then I found them again in a better version, and then I put them back into the build because I realized it's actually a pretty nice extra damage boost here. There's also the option to run Pant and Glyphs, like a lot of rogue builds, for example, do. But I think that the Asus heirloom buff, first of all, is a bit stronger. The crit buff is just really nice. And it also works on bosses, which is a significant obstacle for this build. So we do have the ice shards, and we invest a lot into single target damage because of bosses, and Asus actually helps you there. So this is why I like those. And with enough cooldown reduction in the end game, I felt it was not really that necessary to have extra evade charges, for example. I'm a big fan of extra evade charges whenever I can run non-unique boots, but it turns out it's not that important. And this extra movement speed and extra damage just turned out really nice here. Another few aspects we have Edge Masters, so this is just extra damage. Storm Swirl, extra damage against vulnerable while you have a barrier. You always have a barrier, either by using ice armor or just any of your other cooldowns because of the protection passive skill here. So we get a barrier for 3 seconds. So this is quite useful. And for example, in the early game, there's also the protector aspect that gives you a barrier when you engage elites. And this also helps you with this uptime of this aspect here. And lastly, there is the conceded aspect. I put it on the neck just for extra damage. Again, this is kind of unconditional damage increase. You usually have a barrier up almost all the time. So unless you are getting absolutely plowed by enemies, this is just really helpful and works in all situations, including the boss. To finish with those items here, the stat priorities are basically similar to most other Sorc builds, I imagine. So lots of cooldown. You want to have the offhand with the cooldown roll. You want to have the amulet of cooldown, and of course the helm. So make sure you get as much as possible. It just helps you making everything more fluid, helps with the prodigy aspect, etc. So especially once you hit like level 70, 80 or so, you're going to have a lot of cooldown available, and it's going to be very noticeable. In the early game, it's a bit more slow. The resource management is a bit harder, so you may sometimes have to like kite around and wait a little bit, but it gets a lot better later. Mana cost reduction, same thing, same with the resource generation here, I mentioned that earlier. And then offensively and defensively, it's kind of like standard crit, vulnerable, You want to have your core skill ranks, of course. So we have that. We have attack speed here. This could also be lucky hit if you get that. I actually never found gloves like that. I was kind of missing one stat here all the time, and it was still working fine. And then defensive pieces should look like this. You want to have armor, damage reduction, damage reduction, damage reduction. So there are various combinations of close, distant, burning, general damage reduction, and the armor, of course. So you want to try to just get 4 of these together with high rolls, and you're going to be much more protected. Outside of that, a little bit of extra life doesn't hurt. For example, here on the ring, on the helm. So this is where you want to get some life. And again, also lucky hit. So here we have lucky hit while you have a barrier. We have the wand, so you don't want to run a dagger. But this is about it for the items. Now going over the skill tree, so the standard variant that I was playing is this one here, the 50 to 100 and the speed farming variant. I figured there's not really a need to really make big adjustments here. This is essentially what you do leveling up anyway. So we have full investment in Frozen Orb and Ice Shards. I have greater Frozen Orb to make stuff vulnerable, and we have greater Ice Shards to deal more damage as if the target were frozen. Now it turns out this effect actually doesn't give you like all of the frozen multipliers. For example, there's the Hoarfrost passive that gives you extra damage to frozen enemies. There's the control glyph on the paragons that gives you extra damage to frozen enemies and stuff like that. So this frozen effect only applies to the Ice Shards frozen effect, which is plus 25% multiplicative damage increase, which is still not insignificant, but also not that crazy. So if you have any kind of trouble with your vulnerable uptime, there is a very easy way to solve this, which is destructive Ice Shards. This just makes enemies vulnerable. In fact, this is what you should be using in a tier 100 push. Actually, when I was playing this build in tier 100 on the boss fights, I completely forgot about this, and I didn't switch to destructive Ice Shards. But this is what you should do. So it just makes a boss fight a lot faster than what you might have seen in my video. And it doesn't really come at a very high cost, because all you lose is this 25% extra damage while you have a barrier up. Now this is obviously nice, but vulnerable is much nicer. Because otherwise, when you have a long boss fight, usually what you do is you use Frost Nova, you have a 6-second vulnerable window, and then sometimes you have these random Frozen Orb procs from the enchantment, and they also make enemies vulnerable. But sometimes you just have like a really long fight and the vulnerable doesn't trigger, and you have to do it yourself with a manual cast of Frozen Orb, which does much less damage on a single target. So whenever you have any kind of trouble, long boss fights, you just go destructive Ice Shards. It's going to make those boss fights much better. And especially in a tier 100 push or in any kind of high tier scenarios. So that's one of the significant changes there. And outside of that, going from speed farming to pushing, I also removed the Frost Nova. I added in the Flame Shield. It's just very useful. Extra speed, immunity, and the healing. So you don't even rely on health potions. And it just smooths out the entire build. And I think I put a few more points here in protection and mana shield. You see, I took out the precision magic. So these are the main adjustments here for harder content. The rest of the skill tree is relatively straightforward. We have the teleport with damage reduction, we have ice armor with the mana regen, here's the Frost Nova for vulnerable, the align the elements 1 point plus the passives behind it for extra damage reduction, and the barrier application. Devouring Blaze, extra crit damage, we apply this all the time with the Fireball enchant. This is like one of the reasons why we have it. And all of these cold passives here, just extra damage against shield, frozen, vulnerable, elites, etc. and some mana, very strong, and the avalanche passive. As for the paragons, there are some adjustments I made from last time, so I tried to min-max this whole setup a little bit to just work better. One notable change here is I picked up the Frigid Fate legendary node that gives you 15% extra lucky hit. You are actually also pretty close here to another 10% lucky hit with just 5 points. So that will be an option if your damage feels good and you just want to like trigger more avalanche, then this is an option, but I felt it was not really needed anymore. So I just went for that with those points here, and I just optimized the pathing across the board, and I also changed the glyphs around a little bit. So the glyphs we have here are control. This is the most powerful one. It gives you tons of damage to crowd controlled enemies, and then another 20% multiplier when you freeze enemies. So this doesn't work on bosses, but on everything else this is superb. I have the unleash glyph. This is actually really nice here because lots of damage reduction from those magic nodes around here. So there's damage to shield that's getting buffed and damage reduction from shield. And you get a bit more mana. It's not really required. There are other options instead of this one. You could also use one of the rare buffing glyphs, for example, here, but I went with this. Most notably, you could change to the tactician glyph. This also has a similar effect to the Unleash glyph, with buffing all these surrounding nodes, and it gives you another damage bonus with the condition of casting defensive skills, which you do quite regularly, or the Exploit glyph. So this is like the most offensive option here, where you get extra vulnerable damage, and then you stack up this vulnerable damage effect as well. But then you have to stack dex on this glyph, so that you have to shift a few points around. I kind of like this one. It also gave me a bit of mana, and I really like the overall effects of this glyph. Then we have Flame Feeder. So this is something that I put in instead of Exploit glyph. Turns out that the math shows it's actually just slightly better than Exploit glyph, or plus minus the same with a stacked Exploit glyph. So basically you have a lot more like burst damage now with this glyph. You could also do the Exploit glyph if you have that leveled and you don't have this one. Then there's Reinforced. This is a rare buffing glyph. There's this burning nodes here. So we have damage to burning, damage reduction from burning, which again we get from the Firebolt enchant. And it gives you extra damage reduction. This is about to get buffed. Very nice. And we have the last glyph here, Destruction, for the crit damage. So this one comes quite late on the 5th board, but we have the most dexterity here for the most crit damage, and then this stacking effect again. Now, while leveling, you can shift a few of these glyphs around, but depending on if you have them level to 15 or not, you may not be able to actually activate their secondary bonuses, which is quite important. For example, if you already have a pretty high crit chance and you're struggling with the bosses, then you could do something like this Destruction glyph here on the first board, or even the Exploit glyph, and just like try to get a bit of extra damage there before you actually change to this setup here. Outside of those glyphs and Frigid Fate, I also pick up Icefall. This gives you a barrier of 50% of your maximum life every time you kill a frozen enemy. With like 2 Frozen Orb casts or so, you generally freeze enemies, and you just proc this effect all the time. So as you mow your way through dungeons, especially now with the Nightmare Dungeon density changes, I think it's going to feel really good. And in like regular combat with like many targets occasionally being frozen and dying, this is going to be superb. So as long as you constantly freeze and defeat enemies, you're going to be basically invincible, mostly because of this legendary effect. And there's like a bunch of other really nice stuff that we pick up. Mostly damage nodes. So here's, for example, damage to chilled and non-physical damage. Here's damage reduction from chilled. Here's vulnerable. Lots of stuff like vulnerable on the Frigid Fate board, and also vulnerable damage reduction. Here's burning damage reduction and burning damage on the Burning Instinct board. And finally, we have a bunch more non-physical damage. Just basically a bunch of good rare nodes that are picked up on the way here, and optimize the pathing a little bit. In terms of gameplay, the build is actually quite straightforward. The only real difficult part is trying to hit the Frozen Orb at exactly the right distance, because whenever you cast it, it will have a set distance, it travels and then explodes in that space. And it will also explode 2 more times with a delay, so you generally want to try to keep monsters in exactly the right place for an extended time. Now, it is relatively easy when they don't just rush at you and you can actually freeze them. With like 2 casts or so, usually they are frozen, so when they don't already die from the explosions, they will not move. But a lot of times you have enemies just rushing at you, and it's a bit uncomfortable. But there's also the Frost Nova. This is like a high tier attempt right now, but usually you can use the Frost Nova, where you can just like freeze enemies in place when they rush to you. You have the Ice Armor you can use as a defensive option. You have Unstoppable from Ice Armor from the Aspect. You have Unstoppable from Teleport. So you're generally fine just breaking any kind of crowd controls that may hit you, and then repositioning either with Evade or Teleport to try to hit at the right distance. This is the most important part. The traveling Frozen Orb really doesn't do any damage. It's all about the explosions. So focus on that. And then we have single targets on these elites, and they live a bit longer. Then you use Ice Shards. So whenever there's multiple targets, you don't really want to use Ice Shards. But when there's like 1 or 2 targets, you have like this ricochet effect from the Ice Shards as well. This is the time to switch between the 2 skills. And you want to try to kind of cycle your cooldowns. So there's the Inferno, Teleport, the Frost Nova or Flame Shield, and the Ice Armor. And well, first of all, they give you mana from the Prodigy aspect, and they also give you barriers. Every few seconds, you want to activate one of those skills so you have an active barrier, because this gives you some of those extra damage modifiers. So as long as you're not fighting dungeon bosses, this build is pretty straightforward, especially in farming content or while leveling. You see this here with level 97. I was just trying to hit level 100, farming monsters of the same level. Basically everything just explodes in like 1, maybe 2 pops or so. Especially if you have the Barber on the seasonal right now. But again, I did some of these attempts. I even did the T100 without the barber and it was okay. So there's not really much to worry about when it comes to AoE damage here. It's mostly about solving a single target damage. So you want to try to have these high rolled aspects, you want to try to have those ice shard ranks, and you want to try to just optimize around using the cooldowns in the right moment, so you have those barriers, etc. vulnerable on the boss, and this is how you actually defeat them in a decent amount of time. Now, in the next patch, this build is getting significantly buffed, but so are the dungeon bosses. So yeah, the main weakness of this build is getting more of a downside, but I think it will be just fine as long as you have level appropriate gear and glyphs leveled. So here's an example of a farming Nightmare Dungeon boss. This is with the barber setup, and without the barber it will probably be like another 5 seconds or so in this setup here, but you see the dungeon bosses do die in a decent amount of time. Anyway, this was like maybe around 10 seconds. This seems to be like roughly the average for me once I was kind of min-maxed. Early on, it may be a bit longer, and then with the Nightmare Dungeon boss buff, they were going to have more HP. So generally, boss fights are just going to be longer in the future. And well, this is one of those builds where you can feel it a little bit. But since the AoE damage is so nice, it's not so much of a downside. And this also concludes my guide here. I hope you enjoyed it. I wish you good luck with the Frozen Orb Sorcerer if you decide to play it. I gotta say, I had a lot of fun with this build, but for me it's time to move on. I want to try some more stuff with the Sorc. Especially with the patch coming up, I'm quite excited to try out some Fireball. And also some Chain Lightning in the early game. Let's see how that goes. And you might see some more Sorc guides from me soon. Hope you liked this, and see you guys next time.